thank you for coming. I want to thank the state of Georgia, of course. And I also want to acknowledge that during this time, I want to acknowledge my good fortune. That I have been, ironically enough, in the midst of this pandemic, quite creative, quite alive, quite grateful for that. I have health insurance, I have a retirement plan, I'm happily married. Despite all these disasters, I feel like I've been blessed and I've been safe. And I've also, for the first time in my life, written about timely events, which was not something that I could normally do when I was working full time and had other things on my mind. But these times are so unprecedented, which I know is a cliche, but they've been at once frightening and fascinating and scary and yet inspiring to me. So I want to start the reading with a poem from Life of the Garment, which was published by Bauhan, this beautiful, beautiful book. And it's a poem that's about air, which is now our biggest worry. Again, ironically enough, the virus travels in microscopic droplets, on our breath. It passes from one to the other, and the air is the agent for that. And so, this is a paradoxical presence, that this is the air that sustains us and keeps us alive, and it's also can potentially kill us. So this poem, written long before the pandemic, is about when we, I guess, had a less fraught relationship to breath and air. And let's hope that in the coming days, we won't need to be so afraid of it. United air. Big shot wind blast in the furnace, muscling silver wings. Air's mostly gargantuan, watching its share of extreme sports. It toboggans with the daredevil blood or spelunks the cellular caves. Made avid by love, it pants, canine, a carouser brought low in the mornings by garlic, alcohol. As breath, it's exquisitely attuned, nuanced within our billowy lungs, an impetus for speech and song. Between vibratory prongs, it supports sound, punches our words for us, carries music on its back as it rides through the waves. Slumber's rise and fall brings an easier rhythm. Air begins us, first knock on the door, accordions us through the years to the last dot dash, the final apnea. Oh, air, you paragon of give and take, sow with a billion teats, dry oil for us who bob constant as derricks, nodding horses in your carousel. As we inhale, you fill each of us, a molded gas cast in our image. Exhale and we pour you out, our silhouettes of mist, diffused in the atmosphere, commingled on this globe, rind of our skin regardless. We breathe as one. So aside from the Spanish flu in the 20th century, the images that come to mind are those, connected with plague, or the bubonic plague, the Black Death during the medieval period of European history. And what this pandemic has done for me is made me want to do some research, which is sort of integral to my poems. I like to learn about things, and I like to see if I can make poetry of it. And so I've been fascinated by medieval medicine, by the medieval world. And I'm going to read a poem that speaks to that. And it's called Death Among the Guilds. Best to understand death as medieval, when guilds guide us in this work, masters of every accustomed stripe, fishmongers familiar with odors, barbers, the blood spirals, carpenters keen with structure, unfazed by bones. The decomposed flesh, melted waxen, with wick exposed, is of no concern to the chandlers. Eyes milky and dim differ little than stained glass windows gloomed over stone cutters' gravities. For the resolute alchemist's death is dross, a philosophical but soluble enigma, data for an elixir. Costumed as crows, like them the plague doctors sent out decay, black boils mean business. Busty alewives bubble over brew, bakers their bread, the yeast to rise like the soul will, though much farther, heavenward. The effortful acrobat somersaults against the sky, the juggler, the handless air, the nun supplicant rosary pointed to the star of Bethlehem. Hurry the sleek horses that ride into night, the groom's job. Dress the tables, set out the goblets for mead. Bring in the motley gesture who raises our spirits, bursts us into laughs for the king, his mouth wide and open, his teeth rotten. Masks. We all have masks. I've written a poem with 4 sections about these entities. Let me just give you a little context, okay? The first section refers to a practice among the Iroquois medical society, known as the False Face Society. The members of this society would walk through the woods until they were moved. They were shaman members. They'd walk through the woods until they were moved by a particular tree that spoke to them, whose spirit was somehow powerful enough to be curative. And what they would do is they would carve directly on the tree and only remove the mask when it was done. It was thought that masks carved into living trees, because they were living trees, were considered to be living and breathing as well. And then they use these masks by shamans to cure patients. So the first section of the poem, number 1, Masks, in part is the title, is spoken from the point of view of the tree mask, okay, just to give you some context. And then the 3rd and 4th sections are about the plague doctors, who are not the rock band, which is the first thing that comes up when you Google it, but were the so-called doctors, really actually charlatans who went around during the plague in this grotesque outfit, this mask with a big nose and black leather suit. And it was believed, the big nose was believed to be that was worn because it was believed that pestilence, the source of pestilence was from the gaseous fumes in the water, known as malaria, as in malaria. So I'm going to read you this 4-part poem. And the first one is about that false face society. Here we go. Number 1. So used to grooves, scars, weather, pests am I, that when he cut the bark, carved me from myself, it did not hurt. For once, another purpose. Lifted like a newborn in his hands, my spirits rose to my cells, enthusiastic for the chance, bubbly, kicking up their skirts. Chosen. How many trees can say, even vicariously, they've been human? I looked a sight, bent, twisty nose, crooked mouth, eyes, bullseyes, shanks of curtain horsehair, a winner in a RuPaul's drag race for medical personnel. But I have no dog in it, no ego, a humbled servant, just pretend, mere sliver of a tree trunk made into a mask held by the shaman in front of his face, endowing him with a supernal power to slip through holes at the edge of the world, where the spirits reside to peer inside the body of the sick one. My false face protects them from demons I fake out, a bait and switch routine, when truthfully, at my core, I could still be said to bleed green, throb light, sparkle water. Heartless, I possess an alien health. I see their point. For those indefensible humans, I must pose as someone they're essentially not, a monstering nurse, an immune doctor. 2. These days, the mask shelters us crudely, a habitat for half-hearted hygiene, tented, tarped down, pegged on our ears, liable to slash, slit, collapse, slip, supposed at best to help keep our fingers off our faces for others' sakes. Hiding inside these porous coverings, no more disguise or threat. A mask means I'm down with COVID, a sympathizer, a potential carrier. Understand the worries of the homeless caged at our borders. Levinas writes, our faces are a poverty, to which I add that either save or betray us. 3. Before they resorted to merciless bonfires, smoked air, the pungent reek of goat piss, they recruited sweet scents, no less, fragrant frontal assault against miasmic pestilential stench. Plague doctors stashed inside their enormous, notorious beaks, these valorous odors, those from flowers, mostly roses and carnations, whose bladed petals swirled like exhaust fans against effluvia rising, stinking from swamped Thames. Among this leafy herbal armor was lucid juniper, whistle clean, laurel cool to the nostrils, prickly rosemary, the dark woody chocolate of tobacco, insinuating anise. The wealthy procured exotic spices thought to repel contagion, cinnamon nightsticks and the gummy resin of myrrh, darkly redolent of plum and fig, and hung from the rafters oranges studded with hard budded cloves, like miniature maces anachronistically resembling our coronavirus. Out on the streets, many wore pommaders around the neck, encased ambergris and musk, held tussy-mussies pressed against the nose. Perfume that lady night slays Pong, the dragon. Invisible Cirque du Soleil of smells, whiff, waft, Luftwaffe. How poignant, the choice of scents as medicine, as they agent nostalgia, beauty, bliss against a disease that had no use for subtleties or for the ineffable, vectored by fleas, those biting wits, out for nothing but blood. And this is the last part, 4. Dressed as crows makes sense now. Onyx eyes glassed in like the tinted, inscrutable windows of a sleek limousine, someone wealthy or powerful. You can't see inside, beak like a pirate's hook, immune bone, mandibles snap shut like a lobster's claw. In rumpled black suits, they cast a big shadiness. The best sent out decay, their red subjects splayed like porn, cawing their broken syntax, their bodies typeset askew in the sky to alert the others of a carcass op. A murder of crows, the collective noun, or even its close second, an unkindness of ravens, is not the right term for these birds, happy to mob and hitch a ride on majestic eagles and hawks, to rob eggs, dishevel nests, havoc corn. Excuse them their instincts. Nature made them that way. I know what to call those currently in power, a cruelty of rulers, an abuse of leaders. Okay, going to read 2 more, and then I'll be done. The Pangolin. Reading about pangolins and their place in all of this. Let me tell you the story about the pangolins. The revenge of the pangolins. Some might call it revenge, others exile, even conspiracy, but it's as if the microscopic ghosts of trafficked pangolins have come back to haunt us. Since we've disappeared, their houses, the forests, they chance on persons, often likened to trees anyway. So and thus, they burrow deep inside the hollow of our chest, ball up in the thoracic space that from their perspective nests emptiness. Weird looking, like a gunmetal coonskin hat, a pine cone shambling on little legs. The pangolin is the only mammal known to have scales made of keratin, same as our fingernails, that constitute an imbricated armor, zealously shingled. Prized for its delicate meat and medicinal properties, it is said to stop children from crying forever, coax mother's milk. Right now, she wouldn't know about that. It's made her sick, encrusts her lungs, causes that dry cough, bring up the ventilators. With its long, sticky tongue attached at the pelvis, no less, stretched out like what kids do with bubble gum, the toothless pangolin probes every bronchial tunnel, behaving as it would in the wild, but instead of slurping up ants and termites daily by the thousands, it sucks up with similar appetite each air of her breath. And finally, let me find it. Come in. Okay, this poem, it just grieves me that the comforting and necessary rituals of death, of mourning a death, COVID or not, during these times with family and community have been suspended. And I'm sure we all have stories, if we were lucky not to have a death close to us, that I know of a friend who had to say goodbye to her dying father on FaceTime. My husband and I attended a Zoom Shiva of a young woman who had killed herself. And, I thank Zoom, but it seems to me life is still better in 3 dimensions. So this is the last poem. It's called A Word from Death During the Pandemic. And it's from the point of view of death. These days when I feel distanced from ceremonies in honor of my undoings, a memory arises unbidden of a cliffside funeral in a tiny village, one of 5, linked by rocky paths through terraced hills, where people, cheek by jowl, live in pastel houses, stacked like stucco puppies or snaggle-toothed ziggurats, and comprise a sweet density, pressed as a corsage in my big book. Now the name comes to me, Bernazza, Cinque Terre, a grandmother. All her relations abled to gather there, a silk scarf wreathed round the bed as I blued her body to match the harbor, clayed her limbs. They caressed her so lovingly that I was touched. I'm afraid not with my help was she washed, dressed, and arranged openly in a coffin, propped upon pillowed cushions and placed within a snow-globed hatchback, no Cadillac, purposed as a hearse, small enough for the single cobblestone street. Pedestrians, locals, and tourists hung curbside, leaned against buildings. Shopkeepers stepped out their doors to watch silently, see inside the car as it drove uphill to the ancient cemetery to allow the cortege to pass. led by the priest as mourners processed behind, shoulder to shoulder, in rows of no more than 4, 5, maybe 6 if there were children, some holding hands, others arm in arm, their eyes far away or cast downward. I could smell the fresh grave up ahead, awaiting us, the tang of its historical soil, warm as that August morning, oiled with uncured olives, bitter to the tongue, purpled with grapes, spiked garlic. All those briny marine mineral seepages, fish bones, anchovies, oyster shells, limestone and shale that taste like licking rocks, the terroir of the region, the land of these particular dead. By recalling these pleasures, I mean no disrespect. Please forgive me. I am not at my best. Let us hope for better times when, as a more gracious host than now, I may invite you to my long commensal table for all of us to break bread. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us and being here. And thank you to Bauhan and to Lexi and to Deb for being in this gathering tonight at this particular time too. One of the fun things about reading with someone else is that a poem or story that they have written begins to echo back and exchange with one of your own poems. So I wasn't planning on starting or reading this poem, but to tell you that a number of years ago, I had a chance to go to Six Nations Reservation in Caledonia, Ontario, Six Nations of the Northern Native Americans, and to spend time with some craftspeople there. One man in particular, whose name was Jacob Sky, who was a carver. And he was one of the carvers that Deb mentioned in her poem, a carver of a twisted face, false face mask, which at the end of this time, he graciously gave me. And I have that mask in another place. But this poem from I just pulled it off my shelf from my very first book a long time ago, is called The Carver. At Six Nations, the Grand River thins to a string of blue beads. After a brief rain, flowering lupin, Jacob Sky brings his son into the woods to look for a young larch, the width of his grandfather's face. He finds one opening leaves and begins singing a family song, how a woman loses teeth and a daughter who chews meat for her. The boy laughs, turns toward his father, carving the split eyes, hooked nose out from the trunk. They drop the tree and leave it to dry. Water empties back into the body of the sky. In those hours, lips part, eyes open for a finch to fly through, barely brushing his wings. By night, the mouth moves, whistling the windy melody of the river. They return the next day and carry it on a branch between them. When they reach home, the youngest girl puts up her dolls, disappears behind the house. 12 horsetails hang in the late sun. She chooses one and tacks the hair to fall on either side of the twisted face. Her mother brings a bowl of mashed berries for the children to rub into lips and cheeks, raising a true color. Then they hoist it onto a pole, facing the Iroquois sun, and it is made again, done for this season, surely as the sky lends wind for the mask to sing. So I want to share a few poems from you, with you, as Lexi mentioned, from this new book from Bauhan called Museum of Islands, New and Selected Poems. when suddenly you've been carrying a red-winged blackbird inside your ear. You're as far south as she's made it, which isn't very far. The two of you like thinking of each other and the snow disappearing. One day in March, when suddenly you think you're hearing things, which you are, a scraping, singing sound, a bird trying to sing itself back outside, away from you, so you can listen to her making her first announcement of the day. Not that spring is here yet. There's too much frost to leave the ground, and cold, breath-seeing degrees, and a great need to hold it off until the earth is soft again, and there's a branch warm enough for her to light on longer without needing to fly around your ear to see if she can if she can fly back in. So I live in Cornwall, Vermont, which is near Middlebury, about 10 or 15 miles from the Frost Cabin in Ripton, Vermont, and Breadloaf, and relatively close to Lake Champlain too. And we have one terrific bookstore. Reading in the bookstore. What better place to gather this late Sunday afternoon than in the children's nook of the bookstore? A few adult seats and floor pillows, standing room among the bookcases, designated, it just so happens, for self-help and philosophy, with the right number of shelves for poetry, and space for what volumes the staff picked, having been moved by, leaving handwritten, passionate notes, their recommendations. This book saved my life. I've never read anything like this before. Don't be surprised if you stay up until sunrise, sacrificing a good night's sleep for the unexpected ending. Now, when the little girl behind her big book starts trying to turn the pictures into words, and her mother tells her to be quiet, there's an adult trying to read his poem. To a few customers who wandered inside, to his loyal friends whom he called beforehand, so they could prepare their personal responses, arrange their praise like folding chairs, suggest he revise the title if there's still time. The last number of years, some of you know, I've been posting first drafts and revisions of the poems that I've been writing on Facebook. And I could talk a lot in some ways about that process and why, and how that process of writing every day almost, and walking every day, how they've melded together and how they've turned into this particular process, which you'll perhaps hear in this poem. Why I post poems on Facebook. Not that I don't love the great poems of the printed past, wish that I were Gutenberg's apprentice, or respect the taste and conscientiousness of editors, the value of a poem returned, rejected, still sitting on a desk to be read, to be passed on to another reader before it is chosen, discarded, selected to appear in a journal, a magazine concerned with time, or mailed out again, released like a homing pigeon freed from its coop, or see the importance of living with draft after draft, revision upon revision, until the best version of a poem rises from the ink on the page, or the key of an antique typewriter, the clicks of a plastic keyboard. Perhaps posting is a sign of laziness, a cavalier attitude toward the past, a desire too quickly to see one's name on the screen in order to recall the great work of Anonymous and X. Perhaps these days for a poet to be her own printing press, her own Congress and government, her own version, you may have guessed, of democracy. So you, my love, and my children can search randomly to find me one night in a biography online of Johannes Gutenberg. See the fourth line of this soon to be revised poem, who never signed his name to anything he printed, who loved the feel of cold type, who, if he was here, might understand the urge to send a poem around the world before it is written, before it's ready to be read. So I share this poem with you as a former high school and college football player. But I was thinking about what are some of these big cultural kind of events and icons, and how citizens gather, particularly on Sundays, and simultaneously kind of what happened if each of these some of these icons disappeared. The end of football. No one can remember why it happened. No one received any notice or was told where to redeem their tickets. Stadiums by the sea were swept in, and fields in the Midwest returned to fields. It was expected citizens would know how to cheer for themselves and read silently. Expected wives wouldn't make too much of this, but children would. Rules and flags that had been thrown to enforce the rules were forgotten and held in the same esteem as grass clippings. Groundskeepers rolled AstroTurf back into the laboratory, but not anything green by its own nature. Speaking of nature, people spoke more of it. Sows were redeemed and suckled their young in their sties, secure in their own skins. We didn't have to think of men as lions or bears anymore, but giants and patriots were another story. Cities became known again for their statues, and in one case, for its confluence of rivers. A lot of big men were suddenly out of work, limping and searching for new knees. Living with us now, we needed them to help us remember why we left our families, why we never prayed on Sunday. So a few years ago, I had a chance to facilitate a poetry workshop at a maximum security prison about an hour from here. And what that means by that designation, maximum security, is that most of those 1,900 men, those inmates were incarcerated for multiple life sentences, some of them. And they were there for very serious offenses and crimes. And we could speak more about that. But in the course of being with them and going into that facility, this old, almost 1930-ish prison, as we got familiar with each other in this class, the inmates were particularly interested in form, in poetic form. So we looked at a bunch of different forms. Basically they said, can we write a sestina? And I mean, it was just sort of incredible, which is, here are these guys, kind of in prison for life, in that containment. And what really appealed to them most was wanting to write in a strict form. I had never written a sestina myself, and I thought, if these guys are going to, go back to their cells and write one of these, I had to write one too and bring it back to class. The poem is called "How Difficult Is It?" I wouldn't have guessed you'd love this form and take it back into a cell's darkness. Even the supermoon can't reach you unless you dream that light is meant for you. I mean, it's hard for me to think of so many men, green-suited, shelves for beds, guessing if the moonlight will shine that far back to you and the super darkness. It's darker than I ever thought. I mean, a moon meant for you. I never guessed I'd be inside, this far back into a yard's, a wall's dark light. Locked in isn't a kind of light. Although I can think of darkness as its own light I can take back home with me. Even if it doesn't mean I'm here to guess how it really is for you. I can't know. I'm not you. And that shining slice of light through a cell's window, I want to guess is the super moon giving up its darkness, its secret, shining meaning. So you can find your way back, all the way back to this poem's form for you. So meaningful, so darkly full of light, it won't leave you guessing when I'll come back to be with you. Your guest, a poem turning darkness into light. So a couple more from this book, and then I'm going to close with two poems from a new manuscript. So again, these kind of imaginative speculations, that are both serious and fanciful at the same time, that keep you in the present, but also turn you to the past or a past memory. So this poem invites the reader also to imagine what they would pack and what they would need to take if they were leaving for eternity. Packing for eternity. There's nothing you'll need to save for the afterlife. You won't be able to ask for once you are there. It's not like going to overnight camp with a list of items to help you survive in the woods. A duffel bag of socks and shorts, 2 dress shirts. Even the angels, it was written, were sent away in July for a few weeks by a lake. A few nights to sleep under the stars without any feeling of responsibility to think of them as God. Even the angels, you were told, felt homesick for a few hours their first night away and cried into their pillows so no one could hear them finding a way to be brave. No one knows if it will be any different than what you know now. Didn't summer used to feel like an eternity? Sleeping under the stars, a place you didn't want to go home from. Sometimes we make too much of what we don't know. and turn it into a mystery. Sometimes we spend our whole life thinking about what's to come, making a list of things in a million years we wouldn't need, like that compass and skeleton key, that extra crown. So some of you may remember that when President George H.W. Bush died, and like presidents, was lying in state in the rotunda, that his Labrador retriever, the dog that was always with him, was sitting in state with him next to the coffin. Lying in state. Isn't it his dog we're drawn to? His Labrador retriever, lying in the rotunda, close to the flag-draped military coffin, trained to stay until she's called to be of service. Somehow she knows he's still here, and that wheelchair against the wall was his too. A trainer thought to bring to let her feel less anxious, to sense, if called, it was her job to sit under his shaking hand, which she can't see. It's her leash he's holding inside the metal box with the bone he told her he'd keep for eternity. So these last two poems, and thank you for your virtual patience. These last two poems are from a new manuscript that's called Arias and Arguments. Where it went. First, nothing disturbing the air. Then the feeling of falling. Rain, snow, it is snow. A little at first, then the whole sky letting loose, emptying the clouds of themselves. What's a day that doesn't start with the weather? Opening a shade inside the heart of your house. It appears the wind nudged the door open and was cold enough to let the snow step in, seep in, if it was the preceding rain. That the feeling before that, a heart's possession. Here's where a line can turn into itself, how you become the weather inside your mind, a thought turning into a feeling, or the other way around. No matter what a theory says of how you disturb yourself, what comes first? Not noticing anything? Then walking outside, asking what happened to the field, where it went overnight. So, Deb mentioned the pandemic that we're all in, and these traditional holidays that now are kind of in the past and passing us by into Thanksgiving, the Christmas holidays. And how we've been clustered in our small units and what we feel and think about how it actually was. It wasn't a bad day at all. Setting the table for two, lighting 2 candles, dressing as if we were going out somewhere more fancy than our rec room, putting on a record on the spinning turntable, lifting the needle, setting it in the groove, letting the Messiah fill the space between us, hearing the scratches when you or I must have left the room, forgetting to lift the arm of the diamond needle, letting it play the same note again and again, bumping against itself. Not such a bad memory to make this year. thinking of everyone we missed, we couldn't be with. Although recalling them and all of Handel's arias seemed more satisfying than either of us thought it could be, or would want to say out loud to whomever might be listening, the telephone sitting next to its cradle, a smartphone left on speakerphone. So thank you so much, guys. And we're here to in the time that we have the time to respond to your questions, reflections, anything that you might want to add or to say, and feel free to kind of come on back into the living world here with your pictures and your unmutes.
I have a question for both Deb and Gary. And I guess I would have to describe it as a performative question in terms of performing the readings.
Mhm.
First of all, I'm derelict in not thanking you both for the stunning poetry and the amazing imagery and then the narrative arcs. And your poems are very different, but wonderful nonetheless. But I'm very curious because I've attended perhaps a few thousand poetry readings in my life. It was occurring to me tonight that seems to be a convention when the poets read their own poetry, that the intonation, the prosody is very linear, very flat. My family suffers through my abstract paintings, which I don't title because I don't want to create programmatic art. I don't want to lead the observer, the viewer, in thinking what I was trying to intend. I want the listener or the viewer to make up their own mind. And I was just curious, am I correct in thinking that there is a kind of stylistic choice being made? There's not the usual complete musicality or full range of intonation or variation when you read your poems. Is it to allow the listener or the quasi-reader to make their own judgments about what the emphasis should be or how it should be heard? And I know that sometimes when I read poetry on the page, I imagine it in a very different way than when I've heard the same poets read the poem. So I'm curious to ask you how you make the choice of how to perform or to recite your own poems, if that's not a crazy question.
Gary,
Deb?
why don't you take it first?
Okay.
He's my cousin. It's my fault.
Thank you. It's a great question too.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, particularly because, saying poetry, if you're typing, you're writing, you're seeing it, but you're, then also hopefully hearing it. And, and like many of us, you're as you're working on a poem, you're reading out loud, line by line to yourself as the lines accumulate. And then there are these occasions like this when you're, with other people and being heard. And I guess I hope that in reading that, the reading them does offer some of the feeling, some of the feeling that goes simultaneous, to the visual, to the writing on the page. And just to say, I once heard Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the Russian poet, read, and it was just in a big hall. It was just so performative, and bold and broad. But I think it also is tied to your own personality, your own inner volume.
Yeah. And I'd add that it's not only tied to your own inner volume, but it's your own ear. It's your own voice and the way you hear things. And so, we no longer declaim poetry. We no longer recite poetry. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that we're not writing in traditional, prosody. We're not writing in iambic pentameter or blank verse or rhyme and meter. In some ways we're establishing our own sonic world. And so I don't feel that when I'm reading it's so much flat as it is allowing the words themselves, which their sonic qualities, whether you want to call it alliteration, you want to call it consonants, assonance, there are all these terms for it, but the words themselves have their own sonic integrity. And when I read, sometimes I feel like the poems, if they're really working, and I some of this is unconscious, some of this is felt, if they're really working, the words are making the music, and I'm just following along. In some ways I feel like, really good readings, I'm kind of, and maybe you don't think it sounds like this, but there's a way in which I feel like I'm scat singing, that there's some underlying rhythm and sonic sonic life that is in the poem and not really in my reading of it necessarily. So it's not a performance. It's not me applying myself to the poem. It's the words coming back and saying, this is how we sound, Deb. Now, get your act together. I don't know whether that answers it or not.
Well, if you'll excuse the pun, you're telling me you let the words speak for themselves.
Yeah.
But I also hear in your answer the possibility that on a given night, like music, like jazz, you might give the poem a different reading.
That's right. Depending upon my mood, depending upon the weather, depending upon, the state of the world.
Hi, Gary. I think my favorite poem of yours tonight, or it's hard to say a favorite, but was that marvelous Sestina. And to know that you had written it in that extraordinary environment, and having worked with youth offenders and poetry myself, I'm very curious, when in your time with them did you read that aloud? The next morning, did you offer yours too?
So I was going to the prison 2 times a week.
Uh-huh.
So this emerged, the idea and request to write one emerged on a Tuesday, and Thursday when I went back, they were just eager to. I want to read this. I want to read this, and they really did. They really saw it as a puzzle. They saw the Sestina, the repeating N words, and how it ends. They really saw it as a puzzle that they wanted to make work. And God bless them. I mean, they took it on. And
did you read yours in that same day?
Yeah. I read in between those 2 days. That's when I wrote the first draft of that. But I have to say, in a sense, the challenge. And many of you guys may know right now the work of Dwayne Betts, Reginald Dwayne Betts, his book Felon, and his very very complicated story, but also his super poems as a former inmate, and his new book writes from that. So the challenge, at least for me, was the term appropriation. When that poem says, "I'm not you, I can't," etc. That it was, yes, I was both there, but I wasn't them, and I had to kind of deal with that predicament of wanting somehow to express something, but not as if I really understood.
Right. Did they appreciate that?
They totally appreciated the effort that I would take a risk with them.
Yeah. How cool. It's a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
And is it your only Sestina?
I've run one marathon in my life years ago, the Boston Marathon. It was called One and Done, and that Sestina is Although I occasionally, I mean, I feel the urge to,
Mhm.
the Sistine urge.
Yeah. One.
Deb, I have a question. This is Dan.
Yeah.
So I think a lot about post-COVID world. What does it feel like? What's the implication of it for after COVID?
What, the poems? My hopes, my dreams?
No, the reading of them. So again, the performative part, but doing it via Zoom now, and then, what are the implications of doing readings after COVID?
I haven't even considered it. I just felt like, I wanted to kind of make hay while the sun shone, so to speak, that these are relevant, applicable, timely poems. And, whether they live past this moment, who knows? But
Yeah.
I know that I got to write them. And I don't care about being immortal. I don't care if they're out of date. They help me through this time. So I guess that's what I would answer.
And I just want to piggyback on his thing. And Gary, you might have wanted to.
I was going to say quickly, it's another really good question. There's been a lot critically written about the impact of 9/11 then on a variety of arts, that once that event happened, it couldn't unhappen.
Mhm.
You couldn't take it out of your history, your consciousness. And so you can go online and read about then how artists, how they did and didn't have to deal with that reality and that shadow. And I think in some ways, again, this event, the pandemic, that, how is that going to keep feeding, but also having its shadow over, when you sit down to write and you're both in whatever that imagination is, but the simultaneity of something, just incredible.
The other thing I was going to say is that what I've done, though, in most of the poems is write about the plague 600, 700 years ago.
Yeah.
So in some ways, that which, you're saying is timely or somehow topical, actually, has great historical depth and importance. And so there's history here that I'm working with, that I find fascinating echoes and an a strange kind of fascination and comfort. I find this comforting to go back. So, what can I say? It was, it might sound perverse, but it was actually fun to write these poems. Do I want to write any more COVID poems? Probably. I'm done. But there's lots of other stuff going on to write about these days.
So you answered a better question than what I was asking. What I was asking was just very mechanical in terms of performance via Zoom, via, the actual activity of doing this via Zoom.
Like, do you miss, obviously you probably miss
relative to a
doing
performance
it.
in a bookshop, in an auditorium,
Okay.
and how these circumstances might bear on a future where you're not dealing with COVID and you could return.
I see.
Use this sort of forum again
Mm-hmm.
to reach people in California, et cetera.
So, friends, I'm also a psychologist, and my practice now is particularly now on Zoom, so I'm seeing people, in all sorts of rooms in their house. I'm here, and for many of them, and I would say sometimes myself, this has been very preferable. You lose things. You lose things not being physically, face to face, but there's also been a surprising depth of exchange that actually feels different to me than being in the office.
Right.
And I think for me, it has something to do with people being in their own rooms, their own houses, and connecting, through this virtual air. So what I hope is that they're both, readings in person, when we're vaccinated or whatever, those return, but it's not an either or, that we can do both.
And I feel like there's an intimacy. I know maybe that word's been used, too much, but I feel like there's an intimacy about this form that you don't always get when you're reading in a venue, when you're reading, in 3 dimensions. And one of the things I read in Santa Cruz online early this year, and what I found was that in some ways reading over Zoom is less performative because you are in your own home. But if you turn the sound off and you don't see anybody and you're not reading the chat, which can be so distracting, that you're not worried about what the audience is thinking. It's really between you and the poem. And so you're not waiting for, you end the poem and you're waiting for somebody to sigh with pleasure or, approval or snap their fingers. Well, you don't have that when you're Zooming necessarily. And so it takes the onus or takes the pressure off of feeling like, oh my God, I just read a poem and it bombed, or I just read a poem and everybody loved it. And now how am I going to top that? It takes that layer of pressure away. And so it's really between you and the words and the language. And that to me was actually quite liberatory. And it doesn't mean that I'm some kind of, asocial introvert, but it was a different and a valuable experience. So yeah, it's not that you're snapping, you guys.
I'm just curious about the process of writing a poem, which I imagine is hard to summarize. There must be a lot of different processes depending on who's writing. But is there a way to describe, like, how do you start? Is it different every time?
Maybe the old story. Thank you for that question. The old story of, I don't know, Deb, maybe you remember who says this, but how do you improve on the blank page? How do you improve on the perfection of a white space or a blank page? Mm-hmm. So yeah, even with all your previous experience, writing poems or doing art, when you once again come face to face here, kind of where does it start? Where's it going? And all of the practice that you've had, how is that going to, in a sense, come to bear on that new thing, that new thing you're writing or revising as you come back to it and want to see it. So that process of, what compels you or something that catches you, that starts the poem.
Yeah.
And then how, at least for me, how do you follow it?
Yeah.
Both directly, indirectly. How do you follow the poem? Not only the story, but I think as Deb is saying, the language, the music, the curiosities, and the unexpected. And what do you do with the unexpected? At least for me, the unexpected, and also the parts that want to too quickly either criticize or excise. How do you let what's going to be the material kind of continue to brew and to blossom where that poem is needing to go?
I could talk to her later because she's my daughter.
Oh, really?
But I feel like I never asked you that question. You were Dad.
Perfect.
So thank you for your answer, Gary Margolis, and for your poems, both of you.
Thank you so much, Deb and Gary, for reading tonight. It was so great to spend this time with you and get to hear your new work and your old work. And thank you, everyone, for coming and supporting Bauhan Publishing.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. A pleasure.
Adios.